Hello, class. Today we're going to be covering lesson 12, the Cold War. We're going to break this particular lesson into two parts. And what we're looking at here is the American flag with the Soviet symbol of the hammer, sickle, and star. And obviously that was the competition, the main competition that was going on throughout the Cold War in the years that followed World War II. So the Cold War begins. Most historians would claim that the Cold War began at the Allied conferences at Yalta and Potsdam in 1945 that brought about an end to World War II in Europe and in the Pacific with Japan. Both meetings brought about the start of the United Nations, but the Soviet Union refused to give up communist claims to Eastern and Central Europe, notably the satellite countries and territories that had been obtained on the Eastern Front in the push from uh, Soviet, the Soviet Russia to the battle and siege of Berlin and the fall of Berlin in May of 1945. Many criticized Franklin D. Roosevelt for giving up Eastern Europe to communism at the end of the war, but it wasn't really Roosevelt's nor Winston Churchill's to give away because the Soviets had fought and slogged and battled to maintain control of that territory, and they certainly didn't want to see that fall into the hands of democratic republics, but nor did democratic republics want to see that territory in the post-war World War II era fall to the control of the communists, but they were in gridlock. As soon as American troops and Soviet soldiers met along the Elbe River in Berlin on April 11th, 1945, communism occupied the eastern and central portions of Europe. Here we have a pretty famous image of American and Soviet soldiers shaking hands and meeting along the Elbe in Berlin on April 11th, 1945. This is the symbol of the United Nations, the brainchild of Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who was the longest serving Secretary of State in American history under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Iron Curtain. After World War II ended, American and Soviet cooperation quickly evaporated. Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, claiming that an Iron Curtain had descended across Eastern Europe in reference to the spread of communism and the dominance of the Soviet Union controlled by communist dictator Joseph Stalin throughout Soviet-occupied Europe in the post-World War II era. Stalin had established a large ring of socialist satellite states around Russia, which were all under his totalitarian rule. The political, economic, and social consequences of World War II. The end of World War II found Soviet forces occupying most of Eastern and Central Europe and the eastern portion of Germany. Germany was partitioned into East and West Germany. Eastern Germany was under Soviet control, and Western Germany was under democratic control of the United States, Great Britain, and France. West Germany became democratic and resumed self-government after a few years of American, British, and French occupation. East Germany remained under the domination of the Soviet Union and did not adopt democratic institutions. Ultimately, Berlin would also be divided as well. It started with just a painted line, then barbed wire fence, and ultimately by 1961, a wall will be constructed known as the Berlin Wall, which we'll be dealing with as we move forward in this lesson and our next lesson. This is an image of the Berlin Wall that divided East and West Berlin. Western forces in Berlin the occupation was controlled by the U.S., French, and British. Here we see a person walking their dog on the right, graffiti along the wall. Then on the left, we see the Soviet occupation of East Berlin. Continued, following its defeat, Japan was occupied by American forces after the surrender of Japan on the USS Missouri. It soon adopted a democratic form of government, resumed self-government, demilitarized, and became a strong ally of the United States. Japan, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, was occupied by U.S. forces as early as the fall of 1945. Europe lay in ruins in the post-World War II era, and the United States launched the Marshall Plan, which is arguably one of the greatest pieces of foreign policy in this era. It provided massive financial aid to rebuild European economies and to prevent the spread of communism. It was named for its creator, Secretary of State George C. Marshall, who had served as the Army Chief of Staff under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and will later serve as Secretary of State under Harry S. Truman. The premise of the Marshall Plan was a win-win-win. It allowed for trade opportunities and partnerships with those European nations that accepted American aid, regardless if they were the winners or the losers in the war. The other victory from the Marshall Plan is that prevented the spread of communism in Western Europe. And then the third thing that it did was prevent the possibility of another world war being established in this post-war era. Obviously, that was a little tricky because they didn't know if World War III was on the way or not, because the Cold War essentially was fear of the dropping of an atomic bomb or widespread nuclear warfare. But in the end, the Marshall Plan was really a great opportunity for war-torn Europe to be rebuilt and to prevent continued global war. It doesn't bring about an end to warfare, it just prevents what we saw happen in the post-World War I era and the start of World War II. The United Nations was formed, as I said before. The brainchild behind the United Nations was Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who served as Secretary of State under FDR and Truman. He was Secretary of State before George C. Marshall. It formed near the end of World War II. It came about as a result of three meetings. There was the Yalta conference that we talked about. There was a conference in San Francisco that we haven't mentioned in this lesson, and obviously Potsdam that was held in Germany. The plan for this was to bring nations of the world together to try to prevent future global wars, and the United Nations still exists today. So the Marshall Plan was established by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, who became Secretary of State in the Truman administration after Cordell Hull. VMI graduate, class of 1901. As a VMI alumnus, we're very proud of Marshall's achievements at the Virginia Military Institute. He gave Harvard's commencement address on June 5th, 1947. His speech was better known to the nation as the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Plan, in conjunction with the Truman Doctrine that we'll talk more about as we move forward in this lesson. The premise of the Truman Doctrine was to prevent communism from spreading in the Pacific, Asia, Europe, and globally. Marshall's closing words in the commencement: "Our policy," i.e. the Marshall Plan, "is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." So this was truly a plan to rebuild, to spread democracy, to prevent the spread of communism, and ultimately to reopen global trade in the post-war era. Here we have an image of General George C. Marshall, five-star general, Army Chief of Staff during World War II, and Secretary of State at the end of after World War II. So as far as global politics, the Cold War set the framework for global politics for 45 years after the end of World War II, and we still have a number of Cold War leftovers that we're dealing with in the 21st century. It also influenced American domestic politics, the conduct of foreign affairs, and the role of the government in the economy after 1945. Example would be the Berlin airlift that was a strategic maneuver to aid the Allied-controlled West Berlin to break down a Soviet blockade around Berlin that had been established by Stalin. The airlift was a success, and the blockade was broken that allowed the democratic republics and constitutional monarchies to maintain control of Western Berlin, the United States, Great Britain, and France. And then what we'll do today is we're just going to wrap up and take a look at some of the major symbols of the Cold War. So we'll start here with the flag of Communist China. China will fall to communism in the post-World War II era. Here we have, we'll talk more about that as we move forward in the lesson. Here we have the division of Berlin, Eastern Berlin controlled by the Soviets, and West Berlin and even Western Germany controlled by the British, the French, and the Americans. Here we have the symbol of the Soviet Union, the hammer and the sickle. This is Brandenburg Gate and the Berlin Wall. Here, image of Berlin. This is a flag of the Viet Cong that's actually flipped upside down from the Vietnam War. Here is a service ribbon for the Vietnam War. This is bird's eye visuals, top secret document that's been declassified. These are images that were taken by the U-2 spy plane that showed the missile silos of that was the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis that we'll deal with in our next lesson on the Cold War, hot spots in the Cold War. Here we have a U.S. GI, General Infantryman, in the Vietnam War. This is a dust-off in the Vietnam War here. Here we have tank warfare in the Korean War. This is the Korean Peninsula that will be divided along the 38th degree parallel. And then we have a symbol of fallout shelters that Americans were encouraged to build during the Cold War out of fear of the possibility of a nuclear fallout. So this is a great place for us to stop now. We'll pick back up with the second portion of our Cold War lesson next time. Please let me know if you guys have any questions. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.